This is Wormwood Scrubs. It's a Category B prison, meaning it holds people convicted of serious offences, including armed robbery and aggravated assault. But behind this wall, and in other Category B prisons across the UK, are dozens of peaceful protesters. People convicted and jailed for acts of civil disobedience, mainly on the issues of climate breakdown and Palestine. Now, it used to be very rare in Britain to jail peaceful protesters, but that changed under the last government, and in particular under former Home Secretary Suella Braverman. She introduced a new law that gives the police the power to criminalise some protest that cause anything more than minor disruption. And she introduced new, harsh maximum sentences for those protesters. She even made it against the law to hold a protest that the police deem too noisy. Among those currently held in UK jails are 5 Just Stop Oil activists, serving sentences between 4 and 5 years. Meanwhile, 2 other protesters who threw soup on the glass of Van Gogh sunflowers have just been sentenced to 20 months and 2 years in prison. Now, whatever you think about their protest, they did no damage to that painting. All of these sentences were handed down by the same judge, Christopher Hare, but Judge Hare isn't always so harsh. There was the man who crashed his car into the gates of Downing Street and was found in possession of indecent images of children. Hare only gave him a suspended sentence, meaning he went free. Then there was the case of the 2 brothers who assaulted an off-duty police officer, leaving him needing titanium plates in his cheek and one eye socket. The brothers who launched this unprovoked attack were the sons of one of Britain's richest property tycoons. Hare gave them suspended sentences. Then there was the former police officer who had sex in a patrol car with a drunk woman he'd offered to take home. He was also only given a suspended sentence by Hare. Hare has said the long sentences he hands down to peaceful protesters are justified because it's the will of Parliament. Meanwhile, Conservative Attorney Generals successfully push for the courts to restrict the rights of protesters to argue their case in court. You see, protesters used to be able to make the case to the jury that their actions were proportionate and reasonable. It was then left to the ordinary men and women of the jury to decide whether they agreed. But no, under the Conservatives, judges largely removed that right. Now, protesters who try to explain their motives to a jury are being punished with jail. And of course, it didn't used to be like this. In 2009, 6 Greenpeace protesters scaled the chimney at a coal-fired power station. They argued to the jury that what they did was justifiable because of the harm the power station did to the environment. They were acquitted by the jury in that case, a case that helped persuade the then Energy Secretary Ed Miliband to phase out coal burning in the UK. Their protest had worked. And who was the celebrated barrister who developed a winning defence for those 6 protesters? Well, it was the one and only Mr. Keir Starmer. He had to hand over the case to another lawyer before it went to trial because he was appointed to the role of Director of Public Prosecutions, but not before he'd devised a defence for the protesters that convinced the jury to find them not guilty. But now, Starmer's Labour government won't commit to reversing the measures that came in while Braverman and the Conservatives were in charge. In fact, it's even worse than that. Remember that new law introduced by Braverman to criminalise anything more than minor disruption? Well, originally, Parliament rejected her proposal, but she pushed it through anyway, using what are called Henry VIII powers, meaning that MPs and Lords had little chance to scrutinise the impact of the new law. The human rights group Liberty challenged that process in court, and they won. The High Court ruled that Braverman's measures were unlawful. But now the new Labour government is siding with Braverman, and it's appealing that decision. Unless things change, many famous protests that made the UK and the world a better place could, if they happened today, be punished with jail time. For instance, this is Peter Hain. He's now a Labour member of the House of Lords, but this is him being arrested for disrupting a rugby tour by the all-white South African Springboks team in the late 1960s. The campaign by Hain and others to isolate South African apartheid on the sporting field played a very significant part in the fall of apartheid. He wasn't jailed. Today, he probably would be. Then there were the protests against Section 28, the explicitly homophobic law introduced by an earlier Conservative government that banned teachers from saying anything positive about homosexuality in Britain's schools.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
The campaign against Section 28 was peaceful, but sometimes disruptive, like when a group of women chained themselves to the cameras in the BBC News studio.
6 o'clock. In the House of Lords, a vote is taking place now on a challenge
Of course, these women weren't jailed, but if they did the same today, they probably would be.
Protesting about rights for lesbian and gay people.
In the end, they won. The law was repealed, and the Conservatives ended up apologising for Section 28.
It was wrong to put that in place. We should have removed it sooner.
During protests to stop the UK's involvement in the Iraq War, some peaceful protesters blocked Oxford Street for a short period. Today, they would probably be jailed. And of course, the war was a disaster. And then there are the suffragettes. They often engaged in more than minor disruption. While they were sometimes jailed for their actions, crucially, they were allowed to make their case in court, like when Emmeline Pankhurst made her famous speech from the dock in 1908. She said, "We are justified in our action because of the long denial of justice to women." You see, peaceful protest has long been a part of the democratic process, and so has trial by jury. Indeed, the celebrated judge and legal philosopher Lord Devlin once said, "Every jury is a little parliament." Well, now there's a new parliament and a new government, led by a man who used to understand the role protest plays in making the UK a better place to live. It's time for Labour to remember its roots and reinstate the right to peaceful protest.